Welcome to the debate. Today we dive into, well, a really foundational origin myth of the Abrahamic traditions, the Genesis narrative of Adam and Eve. Now, this is a story that's shaped law, ethics, theology for, centuries, and the debate over its function, how we're meant to read it, is really central to how we approach Scripture itself. So the question we're confronting today is this: does the Adam and Eve narrative function fundamentally as a literal historical accounts, setting up a single biological starting point for all humanity? Or does its true significance lie maybe more in its allegorical, its archetypal meta-narrative about the universal human condition?
Right.
For my part, I'll be arguing for the, let's say, the superior depth and the ethical liberation we find when we treat Adam and Eve as these powerful, eternal archetypes, embodying that big transition from innocence to consciousness.
Okay. And I come at it from a different angle. While I fully acknowledge the powerful moral, the psychological truths embedded in the text, you can't deny that. I'm going to assert the theological necessity of maintaining the literal, the historical referentiality of Adam as a single progenitor. Because look, for traditions rooted in the Apostle Paul's work, if you deny Adam's historicity, well, the core structure of salvation doctrine itself starts to unravel.
Interesting. Well, let me state my position more fully then. Reading the story as a meta-narrative, it allows us to see it as this really profound reflection on the universal human encounter with, freedom, choice, and consequence. The figures of Adam and Eve, they aren't necessarily meant to be the first two individuals who ever lived, but rather symbols, powerful symbols of humanity's collective journey. And that's why the name Adam in Hebrew, it literally means human or mankind. So the fall then, it's not this singular inherited transgression that happened, say, 6,000 years ago. It's a profound metaphor for the universal human estrangement from innocence and maybe the necessary, though painful, catalyst for creating culture, civilization.
That's an interesting point, and I agree the story carries immense psychological weight. It absolutely speaks to guilt, shame, the isolation of self-consciousness. But I frame the stakes differently. The story, I think, must simultaneously maintain historical factuality because it serves as the linchpin for soteriology. That's the doctrine of salvation, particularly within Christianity. Think about it. If the first Adam is purely symbolic, just an archetype, how do we justify the logic of Christ's atonement? Christ, who the New Testament repeatedly calls the second Adam. If sin entered the world merely as a symbol of some universal choice, why did redemption require a literal, bloody, historical sacrifice? It forces a kind of symmetry, you see? And that symmetry, I argue, has to be grounded in history.
Okay, so my best argument for the allegorical reading, it's really rooted in the linguistic and the psychological depth that the original text itself invites. We have to start with the Hebrew term Adam. As I mentioned, it frequently functions as a collective noun for humankind, often translated simply as man or humanity personified, not explicitly naming a singular first man. The text itself gives us that ambiguity.
And psychologically, the fall is, I think, better understood as a necessary, if painful, fall into consciousness, into duality. The tree of knowledge symbolizes that terrifying, but maybe inevitable, birth of the separate, isolated self, where we realize we're distinct moral agents. So the story becomes this enduring existential map for the human condition, not just some dusty history lesson about two individuals.
I appreciate that focus on the linguistic potential of Adam. I really do. But that emphasis on the original Hebrew text, for me, it misses a vital step: how the narrative was ultimately canonized. Even if the original ambiguity was there, and, scholars debate that too, the subsequent canonical texts, they seem to overwrite it.
You mean the New Testament writers?
And built the theological framework that most Christians follow. They explicitly treat Adam as historical. Just look at the Apostle Paul in Romans 5:12-21. He draws a direct and, I'd say, essential symmetry. Paul states pretty unambiguously that sin and death entered the world through one man, Adam, and righteousness entered through the second man, Christ. This parallel, it only works, and this historical grounding is essential, if Adam was a specific individual whose actions had objective, transhistorical consequences. That's the linchpin.
Okay, all right, let's follow that for a second. Let's assume for a moment the Pauline structure is necessary and you need Adam to be historical to make that link work. You're still faced with a massive scientific problem, aren't you? We can't just ignore the overwhelming scientific data on, well, population genetics and paleoanthropology. Evolutionary biology demonstrates pretty clearly that the human population never dipped below a bottleneck of roughly 10,000 individuals. That just flatly contradicts the idea of a sudden creation of a single first pair. Isn't that a scientific non-starter for your entire position? I mean, you're asking us to reject a huge modern consensus?
That's a fair challenge, a very compelling argument, but have you considered the sophisticated reconciliation models that have been developed? I'd point directly to the genealogical Adam and Eve model. This is the bridge, if you will, designed specifically to handle this apparent scientific contradiction.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, here's the core idea. We fully accept the scientific consensus regarding genetic ancestry, that humanity evolved from a large hominid population. No argument there. But the model says we need to separate genetic ancestry from genealogical ancestry. It's actually mathematically and statistically guaranteed that a single pair, let's say a historical Adam and Eve, could have been specially created later, maybe 6,000 years ago, maybe 10,000. The timing isn't the key point. They would have existed alongside already existing evolved Homo sapiens. And then, through interbreeding over generations, they would become the genealogical ancestor of every single person living today within just a few thousand years. So they don't have to be the first genetic ancestors, just the unique genealogical progenitors, the ones whose actions broke the relationship with God described in Genesis. This approach, it tries to maintain Paul's historical link without throwing out evolution.
I see that as a highly creative, perhaps even ingenious attempt to solve a theological problem that's created by historical literalism in the first place. But let me pose a question back to you then. By reframing the fall as this allegorical, psychological journey of maturation, or even, as some scholars like to call it, an original heroic act of self-definition, doesn't this significantly diminish the unique, orthodox understanding of original sin?
Go on.
I'm talking specifically about peccatum originale. Augustine, who really cemented this view for the Western Church, he defined it not just as a human weakness, but as the actual transmission of inherited guilt and inherent corruption. So if the fall is just a universal metaphor for growing up, for becoming conscious, what do you do with that theological loss? The very specific idea that guilt itself is transmitted from father to son down through history.
You're right to point out the tension there. I have to concede that the Augustinian concept of inherited guilt probably must be rejected if you adopt a robust allegorical framework. But I'd contend that this rejection is actually a profound ethical and intellectual gain.
How so?
Well, by letting go of inherited guilt, this idea that we stand condemned for someone else's ancient decision, the narrative is freed, I think, to deliver the existential mandate of personal accountability. It shifts the focus of sin away from some kind of biological state we contracted at birth, like a disease, towards moral actions we commit through our own choices. We stop blaming some long-dead ancestor and start examining our own moral agency, right here, right now.
And I'd add, there's a massive social cost to insisting on that literal foundation and the concept of inherited, transmitted guilt. That reliance on a literal Adam and transmitted sin creates the theological justification for a very specific system of intense disciplinary power.
Disciplinary power.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at this through the lens of social theory, specifically Foucaultian analysis, we can see how the doctrine of original sin became what Foucault called a technology of power. Essentially, the belief in inherited, unavoidable corruption isn't just presented as a theological truth, it functions as a tool for intense social control and, importantly, self-surveillance. It establishes a necessary hierarchy of salvation, right? And it imposes rigid regulation over the individual soul, particularly concerning sexuality, because Augustine explicitly linked the transmission of sin with sexual desire. So the price of literalism, I argue, is his enduring social charter of moral regulation and discipline.
Okay, I see why you'd criticize the societal abuse of the doctrine, and certainly that's happened. But your allegorical framework, it comes with its own intellectual trade-off, namely the loss of theological specificity. The allegorical approach, while psychologically potent, I grant you that, it becomes functionally, well, almost indistinguishable from other world creation myths.
How do you mean?
By reducing the fall to a generic monomyth, Joseph Campbell's universal human journey, and reframing it as just a necessary step for moral growth, the Adam and Eve story risks being reduced to a generic human myth. Or maybe just an etiology, a simple story explaining why life is hard, which you find in many traditions, even within Judaism sometimes. It loses the unique, specific theological claim of historical intervention in divine redemption that fundamentally defines Christianity. If Adam is just an archetype like any other mythic figure, we lose the historical specificity that makes this particular religious claim distinct from, say, Greek myths or Babylonian stories.
Right, but the implication I see from the allegorical reading is precisely that it shifts the story away from fixed dogma towards living ethics. It reframes the fall not as the imputation of sin, like God stamping sin onto us, but as the emergence of an ethical mode of reflection. The necessary, perhaps unavoidable, birth of ethics itself. We move from a state of, let's say, unquestioning external command in the garden to one of internal, responsible self-discipline outside the garden. And this transition provides what some call a hermeneutic of liberation. It unmoors our ethical obligations from, potentially, external arbitrary dogma and reestablishes them as a personal, responsible art of living. The story becomes a powerful tool for self-reflection, not primarily for condemnation based on ancestry.
Yet the historical argument, it serves a vital, ancient theological purpose that actually predates the New Testament. The original intent of the Genesis author, many scholars argue, wasn't simply to write a universal myth. It was intended as a polemical theological argument against rival ancient Near Eastern creation myths. Specifically, think about the chaotic Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish.
Okay, the polemical context.
Exactly. The narrative's real truth in that context is its radical declaration of human dignity in contrast to those pagan narratives. Humans are declared image bearers of a sovereign, orderly God, not mere slaves created from the bloody remains of some chaotic rebel deity, which is what you find in the Enuma Elish. That profound theological declaration, arguably, required a foundational, factual basis to establish a powerful, authoritative counter-cosmology, one rooted in reality against the perceived chaos of surrounding paganism. So that very necessity for polemic suggests historicity was required for its authority from the beginning.
So, we've definitely explored the core tension here. It's this pull between finding a universal psychological truth that resonates with every person's experience versus maintaining a contingent historical necessity that seems required to ground a very specific doctrine of salvation, particularly in Christianity.
Right? It forces us to weigh the authority of, say, subsequent canonical interpretations like Paul's against the insights offered by modern science on one hand and existential philosophy on the other.
So, for the listener, if you prioritize integrating modern science and finding that deep existential meaning in the story of consciousness, freedom, and ethical responsibility, well, you'll likely embrace Adam and Eve as powerful, eternal archetypes that speak directly to our condition today.
And conversely, if you prioritize grounding the core Christian doctrine of original sin and maintaining the New Testament's really crucial symmetrical parallel of the two Adams, then you must find a way, perhaps like the scientifically sophisticated genealogical Adam model, to retain a literal progenitor. The stakes are frankly immense for the traditional understanding of the gospel message. We must remember that the story's historical truth for a great many believers is the necessary foundation for the entire theological structure it supports. Abandoning the literal Adam potentially means the gospel message itself, at least as defined by Paul, risks, well, falling apart.
And yet, the story's ultimate enduring power, I believe, lies precisely in its uncanny ability to mirror the personal moral journey
of every single human being who comes into self-awareness and faces choice. It's not just the story of the first man and woman, perhaps it's truly the story of every man and woman, eternally wrestling with these same questions. End of debate, not the discussion. Comment your stance below.